In Portugal, they speak Portuguese, but now many more people speak Portuguese in Brazil, their former colony. But both is kind of funny when you think about it, because both are surrounded by mostly Spanish-speaking countries. So really, why in this rather small peninsula are there two national languages and not just one? Why isn't Portuguese really a Spanish dialect or vice versa? In actual fact, there are many more languages that are spoken in the Iberian Peninsula, as you can see here. And Spanish and Portuguese both belong to the same group of Ibero-Romance languages, which were descended from Latin. And Latin, of course, was brought into the peninsula by your favourite boys, the Romans, when they conquered it.
And what have they ever given us in return?
They brought with them their language of Latin, and today all of the languages that are spoken in the Iberian Peninsula, except Basque, are descended from Latin. However, when the Romans arrived there were many more languages that were spoken there, all of which, except Basque, have now disappeared. They included Celtic languages, Iberian languages, Basque, and Terdian languages?
Pull yourself together, it's only a bit of poo.
Interesting. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about pre-Roman and the Roman conquest of Hispania, of modern Spain, then you can check out these videos here. But suffice it to say that these languages are important for the future of the languages in Iberia, because while people may have switched from speaking Celtic and Iberian and other languages to Latin, they often brought traces of their former language with them, particularly in terms of pronunciation and different grammatical structure, so that while they may have spoken Celtic at one moment,
a few moments later,
and then switched to speaking Latin, then often that Latin would develop based on the language that had been spoken in that region before. So you started to get different regional variations of Latin that were flavored by the previous languages that were spoken there. Around AD 400, many Germanic tourists came and stayed on the Costa del Sol. These were largely the Visigoths, Swabians, and other groups. The Vandals passed through this area as well, and there are several Germanic words that are retained in various languages in Iberia to this day as well. Now, by AD 714, this Visigothic kingdom was taken over by a Muslim invasion, the Moors. These were largely made up of Arabs and Berbers, speaking Arabic and various Berber languages too, and Arabic has had a big influence on the languages of the Iberian Peninsula. But then where do Portuguese and Spanish come into the picture? Well, the fact is that either a small part remained in Christian hands or rebelled and became Christian in the very north. This was called the Kingdom of Asturias, up in the mountains. And by around 900, they had conquered a large belt of territory in the north, except the Basques, once again. That was independent of Muslim control. And they, of course, didn't use Arabic as their language. They were speaking various descended dialects from Latin. And one of these that we refer to today is very creatively called Galician Portuguese, sometimes Portuguese Galician, because it's the ancestor for the modern languages of Galician and Portuguese. Now, around AD 800, we start to see that this is really differentiating from these other dialects that we have. The county of Portugal emerges as a border region of this larger kingdom that we see around the area of Braga and Oporto, which is today in Portugal. Now, the three main areas, the sub-kingdoms of this initial kingdom of Asturias are Asturias, but also Leon and Galicia, which is in the very northwest. And the county of Portugal is kind of peripheral to Galicia. At times, its counts say that they're independent and act autonomously, and then at other times they are forced back into the fold. For example, in 1071, at the Battle of Pedroso, the Count of Portugal, who had declared himself to be independent, was defeated and killed in this battle, and then the winner, Garcia, named himself Garcia Rex Portugaliae et Galiciae, which is the King of Portugal and Galicia.
But not for long!
Unfortunately for him, his brothers both teamed up on him and took over his failing kingdom of Galicia, and then Portugal went back to being a county.
But not for long!
By 1100, and certainly by 1139, the independence of Portugal was sealed when its count was able to win several important victories and named himself the King of Portugal instead. And several years later, this was recognized by this Asturian kingdom that was to the east, and so Portugal became an independent state. Now, what's going on with the languages at this point? Can we talk about Portuguese and Spanish? Sort of. I mean, the languages that are being spoken here, except Basque, are descended from Latin, with various regional differences that probably already existed in the Roman period and continued to develop. Now, we already mentioned Galician Portuguese that's spoken up in the northwest, and because Portugal had been a county of Galicia at the time, then this language pushes further south. Portugal continues to expand, conquering territory from the Moors to the south, and spreads its language, which will eventually differentiate from Galicia. At the same time, however, this remaining kingdom will eventually center on the area called Castile. This will become the most important center for what remains, what will become Castile and Leon, and eventually Spain. And that means that the dialect of Latin that was spoken in this region became the Spanish language. And that's why a lot of the time today people refer to it as Castilian or Castellano, which is how many people in Spain refer to this language. Now, what does this look like on the ground, linguistically speaking? Well, we can see several developments in one group of languages and retentions in another. So, for example, Latin words like Petra and terra are pretty much the same in Galician and Portuguese, pedra and terra. However, in Castilian, we can see that a process called breaking has happened, where we get piedra and tierra instead. Similarly, morte, which remains the same from Latin, becomes muerte. Initial F changes to initial H, which is dropped in Spanish. So instead of filho, we get hijo, and instead of facer, we get hacer. And similarly, clusters in Spanish are often retained similarly to how they were. So we get clave and llave and ocho, but in Portuguese and in Galician, these have also softened to chave and oito. So we can say that there are some differences from the Latin, from these sound changes that have occurred. Galician and Portuguese developing together, while Castilian has had different influences. And that's one of the main differences between Portuguese and Spanish for the layman. When you hear them, they don't sound like similar languages. Portuguese has a much more complex array of different vowel sounds, while Spanish really sticks to pretty basic kind of Latin ones that you can hear. In a way that's sort of similar to Frisian and Dutch, Frisian has a lot more vowel sounds and combinations and diphthongs than Dutch does. Now, it's possible that Castilian was in some way influenced by the Basques, who I keep mentioning. And that may be where this initial dropping of H came from in the first place. And this again is how these dialects divulged, because in some areas they'd be speaking with people that spoke a different language. And of course the Basques in the Pyrenees were in contact with Castilian speakers, but weren't so much in contact with Portuguese and Galician speakers. So they had an influence on one language, but not on the other. At the same time, of course, these areas in northern Spain weren't These areas in northern Spain were often separated by mountain ranges, and as we've already seen, by political and social groupings as well, which helped to maintain differences and to create new ones. Now, we know that by the end of the 13th century, inside Portugal, instead of using the old Latin, they were using the language of the place, Portuguese, for their laws. So it became an official language at that point, was entrenched as an official language. But we also know from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which are these songs that we have, that Portuguese was also used outside of this kingdom of Portugal as a literary language, as a language of poetry and of songs, that perhaps these soft tones that we found out about just now were seen as being particularly good for that. An important point in the story will be the emergence of Ferdinand and Isabella, who are seen as the forefathers of a united Spain. Isabella of Aragon, a kingdom that was very powerful in the east, and Ferdinand, who was the ruler of Castile and Leon, they married, and their offspring obviously would become rulers of a united Spain. But of course, Portugal was independent, and Portugal didn't become part of this united Spain. Eventually, that united Spain would take Castilian, Spanish, as its main language and slowly enforce that around the place. But Portugal, from its Portuguese origins, already had Portuguese. And even while Spain for some years occupied Portugal, Portuguese was already entrenched as its own language. And when it became independent again, it became clear that Portugal would remain. This also meant that Galician and Portuguese drifted further apart because Galician was part of this Spanish kingdom, and so Galician became influenced by the official language Castilian, while Portuguese, being independent, was far less influenced by Castilian Spanish, and so they grew. At the same time, of course, Portugal from the early 15th century would start sailing around the world, going around Africa to the Indies, eventually to the Americas, of course, setting up the colony in Brazil, and that meant that many people around the world would also learn Portuguese as a second language and bring many words from their colonial endeavors to Portugal to enrich that language. Of course, the Spanish also went to different places around the world, South America, for example, and there are many variants of South American Spanish and words that have entered Spanish through their interactions with peoples there, and this also helped to shift and change the language in their own way. Essentially, that's Portuguese and Spanish, how they drifted apart and changed. It's also perhaps interesting to say, oh yeah, if you are interested, you can watch this video about the languages in Spain that I made some time ago. I haven't mentioned Portugal because I just did Spain, but you can hear about Galician in this video as well. It is important to mention, though, that they do remain similar. They are on a dialect continuum. And if you look at some of these other languages that are spoken in Spain and Portugal, like Asturian, for example, which is its own language, and Extremaduran, you can see that these are in some ways kind of like the halfway point between Portuguese and Spanish. You can see particular differences. Some of them agree with Portuguese, others have been influenced by Spanish, and this is a geographical thing as well. As they have all descended from Latin, then they do have many of the same things. But sometimes we see that they've borrowed words from different languages, which means that we don't have cognates in other languages. For example, Spanish and Portuguese have 89% lexical similarity, where some of the difference comes from is that Spanish has more words borrowed from Arabic. I've seen an estimate that's about 4,000 words borrowed from Arabic and Spanish, which should be about 8%. I'm a bit skeptical about this because I don't know where exactly these figures come from, but suffice it to say, a lot of Spanish words come from Arabic. Now, Portuguese also has quite a few words from Arabic, at least 1,000. I personally think probably a lot more, and many of them are the same that have been borrowed into Spanish and Portuguese. But based on the research that I could do, it does look like Spanish has borrowed a lot more words from Arabic, which means that if a Spanish speaker says a word like alubia, then most likely a Portuguese speaker won't know what is going on. I think they say something like fasole, which is like a bean from the Latin root, whereas Spanish also has this word from Arabic. Historically, this makes sense. Obviously, with the Reconquista, Spain conquered a lot of Arabic speakers who then switched into speaking Spanish, and they had a lot of contact with Arabic speakers throughout its medieval history, which means that there was a lot of opportunity to borrow words. But Portuguese really, had a similar experience. A lot of southern Portugal was conquered from the Moors, so they also had these encounters with Arabic speakers. But so far as I can tell, there's more Arabic in Spanish than there is in Portuguese, which has also helped to shift the languages. But again, Spanish, Portuguese speakers in the comments, please confirm. Feel free to correct me if that does not seem like it's right to you. As I said, it's hard to work out these figures. But anyway, that's why Portuguese and Spanish are different. They are not exactly dialects of one another. They essentially are dialects from Latin that have diverged over time, had different contacts with different people, became entrenched when Portugal became an independent kingdom and retained its independence, while Spain was on a different trajectory, centered on Castile. That became the form, that became the ancestor of Spanish. Perhaps if it had stayed as Asturian, then we'd have quote-unquote Spanish that would sound a lot more like Portuguese. It's entirely possible. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Huge thank you to the patrons for supporting me, and I will see you all in the next video.